But again, I think places like the insurance industry are now starting to come to us and ask us to help them with some of their risk models because they're very concerned about some of the companies they're investing in from a long-term financing perspective and how viable they'll be if they run into water shortages, for example, or if they're prone to flooding. So I think, again, if you start to turn this into an economic discussion, you'll get a lot of companies much more focused on helping you to solve this. Thank you.
Thanks, Sharon. Our next speaker is Chuck Gordon, who is the CEO of Siemens Water Technologies.
Thank you, Mustafa, and thank you for inviting me to participate in the panel. I want to spend just a little bit talking about Siemens and Siemens Water Technologies and what we do and maybe how we fit into a conference like that. Siemens is a global company. We do business in 192 different countries around the world. We have over 400,000 employees. We have about $100 billion in revenue, or a little over $100 billion a year annually in revenue. Siemens Water Technologies, which I manage, is about a $2 billion global business. Last year we did business in 68 different countries around the world. We have about 6,000 employees globally. The way we position ourselves as Siemens is we're a technology provider to the water and wastewater business. So we provide technology for wastewater treatment, for water purification. What I want to talk to you about today are some of the drivers. But before we get into that, I want to displace, there's a lot of myths about the water business. And they're interesting, and on the surface, they're certainly disturbing. There's a lot of myths. And the first myth is it's not a global business. It's not a global market. It's a multi-local market. The best example I can give about that is I had the honor to have dinner at Singapore International Water Week with Minister Mentor Lee from Singapore. And we asked him, why was water Singapore's #1 priority during the first 50 years that it existed as a city-state? And he gave me a very interesting answer. He said that he was a teenager during World War II, and he was in his early teens. And there was a large contingent of British troops stationed in Singapore to protect the island. The Japanese army came down the Malaysian peninsula, and everybody expected a big fight to erupt and a war to erupt. Well, they shut off the water because all the water for Singapore was coming from Malaysia, and the British Army surrendered 2 days later without a shot being fired. He said in the 60s, when he was made Prime Minister, and he was the first Prime Minister of Singapore, the second day after they got their independence, the gentleman that was the Prime Minister of Malaysia had a press conference, and they asked him, why aren't you more concerned about Singapore being independent and being right at your doorstep? And his answer was, if we don't like their policy, we're going to shut off their water. And so his #1 public policy was water. And if you think about Singapore, there's no fresh water on the island, or very little. And what they've managed to do through water reuse, through rain catchment, is remarkable. And today they're almost self-sufficient. They still do some desalination, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. So the first thing I would say is that it's a multi-local market. And Mrs. Todd Whitman made a great point. The issues are different everywhere. So to try to use one technology or one policy doesn't work. This market is defined by the local needs. The other thing I would say is countries develop, they use a lot more water. I know I had a couple cups of coffee this morning, and there was a lot of water that went into bringing that cup of coffee to me in the restaurant. And you don't think about it, but as countries develop, as economies develop, the amount of water used is tremendous. The second thing I want to talk about is the myth that the world's running out of water. It's just not true. We've never had a lot of fresh water. If you look at the world, most of the water in the world is tied up in the ocean. It's seawater, 96.5%, 97% is seawater. There's a lot of it tied up in the polar ice cap. There's very little surface water. There's very little fresh water. It's less than 1% of the water around the world. But you know what? We're not running out. The hydrogen cycle, which I think we all learned about when we were 12, still works. Still in place. You know, I always tell that my friends in Germany, where Siemens headquarters is, that it snows in the Alps it melts, it runs down the Rhine River, it goes back to the ocean, evaporates, and it ends up snowing again in the Alps. That's the hydrogen cycle. And it goes on, it hasn't changed, but there's not a lot of fresh water in the world, and the big challenge that we have is the population growth in water-stressed areas. So when you think about some of the mega trends that we have, things like urbanization. You know, there's 20 million people or 25 million people living in Beijing in northern China now. Puts a lot of stress on the water supply in northern China. Same thing in Western Australia, same thing in the Arabian Peninsula, southern Spain, southwest portion of the U.S. There's probably as much water as there ever was in most of those places. There's just a lot more people. So certainly the population growth is a big issue. Urbanization, as we develop, industry uses a tremendous amount of water. And what we're trying to do at Siemens is address those needs. So when we take a look at what we can do as a corporation, and we're a for-profit organization, so we do this to make money. But what we're looking at is what are the things that we can do that make our technologies more attractive to somebody building a waste treatment plant in Beijing, or somebody building a desalination plant in Western Australia. And what we look at, there's a few real drivers in the industry. The first thing is, and somebody mentioned it a little bit earlier, the water energy nexus. And we'll talk about that, but wastewater treatment plants are incredibly energy efficient. In a typical wastewater plant, 30% of the operating cost is for energy. So anything we can do to reduce energy requirements is a nice value for our customers. Second thing is wastewater plants create a lot of biosolids. In the U.S., every person creates about 1/3 of a pound of biosolids every day. So you get to a place like Beijing or Los Angeles, there's a tremendous amount of biosolids produced by the wastewater treatment plant. What can we do to reduce those biosolids? The third thing is, in a lot of places, Los Angeles is a great example, there's not enough water. It was a desert. There's 30 million people living down there now. What can we do to reuse the water? Because it's going to be, typically reusing wastewater is about half the cost of desalinating ocean water. So from an economics perspective, water reuse makes a lot of sense. So what can we do to provide water reuse, and what are the opportunities for that water? Where can that water be used? So those are the things that we look at as part of our R&D effort when we look at water. The next myth, I would say, or maybe it's not a myth, but it's certainly true. You can't separate wastewater issues from water issues, because in most places, water comes from the river, and you take it, you purify it. It happens every day along the Mississippi River. The best example I can give, I lived in Conroe, Texas. We pulled our water from the San Jacinto River. It was purified. It was distributed to all the households. We used it. We flushed it. We washed our dishes in it. It went back into the San Jacinto River. It went 20 kilometers downstream to Houston. It went into Lake Houston. It was their drinking water. Happens every day all over the world. You can't separate wastewater issues from water issues, because typically the wastewaters, what we're calling wastewater in one community, somebody else's drinking water. The other thing that I would say is that when I used to take a long hot shower in Conroe, Texas, I wasn't wasting water. That's kind of a myth, isn't it? What would happen is that water gets pumped to my shower head. It goes through the shower, out the drain, back into the river. There's no water wasted. What's wasted is energy. And that's a critical point that people don't understand. What's wasted is the amount of energy it took to pump that water to my house, the amount of heat it took to heat that water up, and the amount of energy it's going to take to pump the wastewater back to the waste treatment plant, and then the amount of energy it's going to take to aerate the waste treatment plant so that the organic material can be treated properly. So that's what the issue is. It's really not about water in a lot of cases. It's really more about energy.